Hello, thanks for being in a new video. This time I have a full review of the REDMAGIC 10 Pro. Let's start. This device is a gaming specialist. Of that we have no doubt. In fact, we will talk very deep of several tests we did, but I also want to tell you the rest of features that we will find in it. However, before we have to know the price, which in this case announced for Mexico, its launch price has been 14,999 pesos. This is more or less $730, although we must remember that the prices here are not the same as over there. Remember that REDMAGIC has its global online store, through which it ships to several countries, so it sometimes adapts its prices. There's also a 512 gigabytes edition, but there is no price announced for Mexico. The truth is that in this price range there are few devices, and generally they are somewhat alternative devices. Not so popular brands for some strange reason. This is a price range where we will find, for example, its cousin, the Nubia Z60 Ultra, which is much more focused on cameras, but still offers good performance in gaming. So if you also like the photographic section, you might consider that option. But what do you think if we start to describe it physically? As for the design, we will find very straight lines all around this device. The front has ultra-reduced bezels, and I think that is a point to highlight as something very positive of this model over past generations. There is no doubt that the bezels are very small and that makes the screen gain much more prominence. Here at the front we find Gorilla Glass protection, although the manufacturer does not communicate any specific level. So either way you have to treat it with care. But at least we have some level of security of resistance in the screen. On the right side, we will find many things, to start with tactile triggers on the edges that we can take advantage of when we are playing. These triggers have a sampling rate of 520 Hz, so believe me, they respond very fast. We will also find there the grill for ventilation, as remember that this device has an integrated fan to cool the processor as best as possible. Then we find volume buttons along with the on-off button, which is in a completely circular shape, and then a switch that by default opens the game suite. Although we can also configure it to do other things. After this switch, there is still another microphone placed, surely to be able to capture the voice well when playing. At the top we will find sound output grill with multiple perforations. There is an infrared microphone to act as a universal remote control and the headphone jack. On the left we only find another grill for air circulation, while at the bottom we will find the tray where we can place 2 SIM cards, plus another microphone, the USB-C port, and finally the main audio output, again with multiple circular perforations. The edition I have in my hands is the Dusk Color edition. It is also available in Shadow and Moonlight. And on this back we now find a little less text compared to past generations. In the lower left corner is the logo of this brand, while at the other end is an X that does not refer to the social network X, but to the 10th generation of this device. In this case it has some transparency that would allow you to see a simulation of welds, because I do not think it is the real thing, but there it is. You even see several screws through these transparencies, and you get to slightly perceive the seal of Snapdragon 8 Elite, which is the processor that includes this device, along with the fan, which, by the way, has RGB for more FPS. As always, this illumination is not only on the fan, but also on the REDMAGIC logo and the X that I mentioned. Even also on the touch triggers, we are going to find another indicator lighting to be able to distinguish them more easily, so we have lights everywhere in case you see it necessary. It is also worth noting that the cameras do not protrude at all, something quite curious in a smartphone from the 2024. The device has a weight of 229 grams, which is remarkable considering the tremendous cooling system that integrates and has a thickness of 899 millimeters. It's not going to be characterized by being very thin, but it's got a tremendous battery, plus all the cooling that I mentioned a moment ago. So in design, I don't think it disappoints, although I think considering that REDMAGIC is already several generations down the road, we might start demanding water resistance more strongly, since it will be one of its main absences. The screen is 6.85 inches. It is a really big screen without necessarily increasing too much. The size of the device, because as I say, the bezels are very thin, and also not having a perforation for the front camera allows a virtually full display. The screen has a resolution, 1.5K to be exact, is 1216 x 2688 pixels, shows a very good level of detail, the text looks sharp. It is a spectacular screen wherever you want to see it. Its technology is a mold, so the colors are intense, it has high contrast, and in this case has 144 Hz in its refresh rate, as it could not be otherwise. It gives us a fairly high refresh rate. Although there are other devices that even have 165, although I see it unnecessary, then I see well the incorporation of 144. In fact, I would have liked to see only 120 to optimize a little more the battery consumption, but it is not something I can complain about. It really is a very good screen that has a peak brightness of 2000 nits, so even in bright sunlight we're going to see content well. Remember that it also supports HDR, so in terms of peak brightness there's a good quality. Minimum brightness also drops considerably. Although it should be noted that it doesn't have the extra dimming setting in the accessibility options. However, the specialty of the screen will be the speed of response with respect to the touches and gestures you make on it while playing. So it has a global touch sampling of 960 Hz. But also the manufacturer gives some other data like instantaneous touch sampling of 2500 Hz, which I guess will refer only to touches, and special touch sampling of 2000 Hz. In general, the screen will respond very fast when you are playing, and that is a very competitive advantage. Good. In the display settings we will find, among other things, dark mode, reading mode or night mode, and there are 4 different color calibrations that you can use when selecting how you want the colors to be represented on the screen. Whether you want colors a little more saturated, a little softer, in general I think all the calibrations look good, and also has a manual adjustment of the screen color temperature or white balance though. I would like this to be fully automatic. By the way, the refresh rate can be adjusted automatically, and you can even show or hide the current refresh rate displayed on the top of the screen. So on screen, it doesn't disappoint. Now let's talk about sound. This device incorporates 2 speakers, although 3 sound outputs. At the bottom is the main speaker, which is the one that has the greatest presence of bass frequencies. It sounds really very good, with good power, and the complementary speaker is located in the upper area, with an output through the earphone for calls and another output through the grill that is in the frame. However, this complementary speaker does not have as much presence of bass frequencies, although it complements the experience well, but let's say it is not a completely symmetrical sound. Still, I think the sound experience is positive with respect to how it sounds, but what do you think if we listen to a test? Although remember that it is not the same to listen to it live. In this case, the manufacturer also incorporates through software the DTS sound configuration, with which you can access different equalization presets, or even manually to a 10-band equalizer that you can customize without the need to have headphones connected. So you can perfectly adapt the sound depending on your taste in music. In addition, another highlight is the integrated headphone jack, which for gaming is very good because there is 0 latency when playing with these accessories connected. But if you prefer to use wireless headphones to listen to music, for example, we will also have good news. Not only supports the SPC and AAC codec, but also supports the aptX codec, aptX adaptive, and LDSEC. The only thing it would not support would be LHDC, although it is a slightly less common codec within high-resolution wireless headphones. This cell phone incorporates 3 microphones, one on the top, one on the bottom, and one on the frame. Because if you are holding the device this way when you are gaming and streaming, the audio could be picked up better. So it seems to me well-placed a microphone arrangement, taking into account that it will be a device focused on gaming. Since there are other devices that place a 3rd microphone in the area of the cameras to be able to record in a better way. But I insist, this is more thought at the time of streaming while you are playing, or you could be recording your gameplay directly with the captured audio. Let's listen to a test. In this case, in a quiet environment, capturing voices, it behaves really very well. But let's hear how it behaves in a very noisy environment, simulating what would be a concert. Definitely the microphones in this kind of conditions are going to suffer a lot more. There seems to be a lot more distortion. You don't get to capture the audio with the desired clarity. So for concerts, that would definitely not be an option. Plus the cameras are simple. Finally, regarding the vibration motor, it is on the x-axis that is going to give us a premium feel. In fact, in the settings, you can configure whether you want a low, medium or high vibration. And I insist that being on the motor, X feels more like a bump than a simple vibration, so really the experience when playing is going to be good. Even when touching the triggers and interacting with other areas of the system is well optimized. The front camera of this device is located below the screen. It has 16 megapixels in its sensor, f2.0 aperture and fixed focus. By default, the device has no quick shortcut to enter the camera, and according to REDMAGIC, this is the second generation of this camera below the screen. However, as you can see, the experience is not snappy, as it takes quite a while to be able to process the image and optimize details, contrast and more. Note that it takes a long enough time, although the result indoors and in optimized lighting situations can become attractive, considering that we are talking about a camera that is located under the screen. It has a beauty mode in the bottom right corner with a single slider, and at the top it has filters that you can preview in real time. In the settings, it includes an option to automatically take the picture when it detects smile. It is also able to recognize this gesture or also the gesture of the palm of the hand when taking pictures. However, remember that it cannot take pictures in a repetitive and constant way, and if you hold the device in the hand, it will not be able to take pictures in a repetitive and constant way. The level of detail is not horizontal. You can also configure the touch triggers to act as a shutter. We all already know that this front camera is not so good at taking pictures. I just want to show you some examples to confirm it. The sun's rays could cause some very ugly reflections since the camera is behind the screen. It's a camera that doesn't have such a good wide level. You need to stretch your arm a lot if you want to have a wider frame. Also remember that it has fixed focus in backlit scenarios. The preview still doesn't look optimized, although fortunately it does seem to do some good light and shadow processing. In fact, when there is no ray of light projected directly towards the camera, it performs better because it avoids those annoying reflections that appeared in past examples. Notice how, for example, indoors it seems to be a camera that feels a bit more comfortable. The level of detail is not as good as indoors. It's not that high, but through artificial intelligence, it optimizes everything, and overall I think it does give us good performance. However, note the tremendous result it gave us at night, and I say tremendous as a bad thing, as it has spots on the face and definitely the result is very ugly. It simply confirms that it is not a device designed for selfies. So, I think this front camera is a little more work towards video calls than to take selfies. By the way, the portrait mode is actually not portrait mode because it doesn't do any blurring in the background. Regarding the cameras, we find 14mm for the ultra-wide camera with a 50 megapixel sensor, f2.2 aperture and fixed focus. The main camera is 24mm, 50 megapixels on the sensor, aperture f1.9 optical stabilization, autofocus, and in this case the sensor is the OmniVision OV, with a size of 1/1.5 inches. And finally we find the macro camera, which is 2 megapixels, aperture f2.4 and fixed focus. Nothing remarkable. We all already know that this device does not focus too much in photography. Note that it is not so agile when taking multiple pictures. If you hold down the shutter, if you start a much faster burst. Our test trying to capture the number 3, note that we see a small delay, but it is minimal. So if you respond quickly, although note that the burst, it takes more or less half a second to start, but we could say that it is infinite since it does not have any specific limit. Although when reviewing it seems that at times it messes up the result a little. But definitely that you have very good capabilities in terms of burst. Again, at the top we have a button to select different color filters that we can use when we are taking pictures. And also note that in this button we are going to find 2 different ones. Color adjustments, whether we want it to have more natural colors or more intense colors, which interestingly enough is named precious. The device has several photography modes that you could get to take advantage of and similar things, and it also has the expert mode where we will be able to manually set different parameters. For example, the shutter speed that can reach up to 5 minutes, which is very, very remarkable, although only those who are more experts in the photography. You also have the type of metering. At the top, we are going to find ISO white balance modification that can go up to 25,600, something that could also become very prominent. We also find focus, exposure compensation, and we can even activate interval photography. At the top, we could lock things like focus, exposure, and white balance. We can take a look at the histogram, and it's even capable of taking raw photos, so despite not being a specialist in photography, it has a very good expert mode. It also has a special mode for scanning documents with which you can use the ultra-wide camera, and you have 3 different capture modes. One that would be like a cropped photograph, another that would give it a monochromatic touch, and another with an enhanced and optimized capture. It doesn't have automatic detection of the document edges. But when you take the picture, it does the cropping, and as you can see, it also optimizes the color, so it is a considerably good scanner. Although it will only be a picture, and it doesn't allow you to add pages. And finally, to scan QR codes, you must enter Google Lens. The shortcut is next to the camera shutter, and with it, if you can do this scanning to access any information. Let's start by describing the ultra-wide camera, which seems to me to give a good result overall. Outdoor photos, I think, come out well. Colors are not as accurate, but good enough. The main camera has a slightly warmer touch in colors, maybe a bit more accurate. It also improves the contrast, so I like it better. By the way, I could also take panoramic pictures with both the main camera and the ultra-wide camera, which is a good thing. And this panoramic picture does have a high resolution, so in that sense it performs very well. Regarding the zoom, note that we can jump from 14 to 24 millimeters and then to 72 millimeters. Where it makes an effort to get good detail, however, it is noted that it does not maintain optical quality. So it does not seem to apply cropping on the sensor or something similar, as what we see in more advanced devices in terms of photography. In fact, in the 5x zoom, we are going to appreciate a low level of detail, so it is definitely not recommended for those who are looking for a specialty in photography. The 10x zoom has even less detail, so the maximum zoom from my point of view should be this 72 millimeters. In other words, indoors the ultra-wide camera seems to perform well, albeit with a little less contrast than we would like. The main camera improves a bit in terms of color and slightly better contrast, but it is still not something so spectacular, although for a good amount of people this will still be a good result. And in the evenings, using the night mode, the results I think are nice with the ultra-wide camera, although it doesn't have as much texture for the purpose of noise removal, so we don't have such an advanced result. But the main camera gives us better results, especially in terms of the ultra-wide camera is able to maintain the textures even in the darkest areas. In fact, I am surprised how well the main camera behaves in night conditions. In this aspect, I think it does very well, and is surprising for a device focused on gaming. In both cameras, we will find a special high-resolution mode, although it does not seem to have as much detail as mentioned in the sensor resolution. As usual, the main camera will offer us a bit more detail in this high-resolution mode, but let's move on to the next thing. For moving pictures, we will also see a good performance with both the ultra-wide camera and the main camera. And in backlit scenarios, we do not see a well-optimized preview. As if there are burned areas, and the result with the ultra-wide camera is a little bad, as the shadow area is a little darker than the account, while the main camera does a slightly better job, especially in the shadow area. But the highlight area is still slightly overexposed, confirming that this is a device that definitely gives very little priority to the camera. As for macro photography, this is as close as you can get with the main camera, as you realize it's a non-uniform focus due to the aperture characteristics and the size of the sensor. But you could get good macro shots if you wanted to. Take a picture of a low-relief object. If you want to be closer, you can use the macro camera, which also has a little more uniform focus, but from my point of view, the color is very bad. And lastly, with respect to portrait photography, note that it's not an expert either. There are several areas that it focuses on that shouldn't be in focus, other areas that it doesn't focus on that should be in focus. So it's really not good. If you are a little closer, maybe you could have a little more accurate results, but I insist that it does not seem to be a specialist in this. For video recording, this device supports up to K, which is very remarkable, especially if you want to record something and then trim it in post-production or something like that, so it has good capabilities. It even has a pre-button that allows you to have a sort of 10-second buffer before you press that you want to start recording video. Like, you realize when it gets to 10 seconds, it's going to restart, let's say. So you have your previous 10 seconds before you press the shutter button, which I haven't seen on a lot of devices, and I find it a useful feature if you want to record a specific moment. You can also turn stabilization on or off, and it has a beauty mode, which in this case supports full HD resolution. When you start recording video, note that the zoom appears with a slider, although it does not allow you to switch between cameras. We will also be able to take pictures and pause and resume the video, plus turn on the flashlight, all this while we are recording. Even brings a selector of the intensity of the flashlight in case you want to adjust a little softer or stronger light. That is something positive, but does not let us rotate the front camera without stopping the recording. Video mode. Within the expert mode, you can also activate a video recording mode, and it allows you to manipulate all these parameters without the need to cut your video recording. Even as you can see, it has these highlights, so you know specifically what you are focusing on. So it has very good tools for professional video recording. The ultra-wide camera meets a good level of recording since it does support 4K resolution, plus the result looks very sharp with a good bit rate per second, so no strange effects. Overall, I think it is a camera that records with good quality, even the colors come out well. Here the drawback is that it does not allow us to switch to the main camera without stopping the video recording, so that's quite a lot in a device of this price. Despite that, it does allow us to zoom with the ultra-wide camera, but obviously it has little detail compared to what we would achieve with the main camera. The main camera is also going to offer us a good quality in video recording. Just in this case, it seems that the reflections affected us a little more than necessary, but note that the level of detail is also good. It also has recording in 4K, and in this case notes that the zoom can be varying smoothly. It is not seen with sudden steps, and the maximum zoom is 10x, where you see a level of detail a little exaggerated. Perhaps the appropriate would be a maximum of 5x. In interiors, observe that it continues to maintain a good performance. In this case, the ultra-wide camera, I think, does a good job maintaining good colors and good noise control. Although it will always be more advisable, the main camera, as it has a larger aperture and therefore better light input, so it saturates colors better, has better contrast and even better noise control. At night, I'm surprised that the ultra-wide camera does not generate so much noise in the darkest areas. Yes, it does. You get to perceive a little, but let's say within the acceptable range, still maintains a good level of detail, although in the specifically darker areas, if you will notice a much greater presence of noise. Definitely, that the main camera will do a better job in this aspect, recovering much more light and therefore better saturating the colors, better control noise and maintaining a better level of detail. Even makes a good enough balance of the areas of lights and shadows at night, so it records well. Now you're looking at a clip with the stabilization turned off using the ultra-wide camera. Just so you can see how when you're walking, and especially when you're running, you're going to notice a lot of movement, and now you're seeing how it looks with the stabilization turned on. Definitely that the video improves a lot without clipping too much of the panorama. Even when you're walking, we see a good performance with this ultra-wide camera, so for action scenes, the quality could be good. Now we are looking at the main camera with the stabilization disabled, and again we are going to notice a lot of movement when walking and obviously especially when running, and with the stabilization enabled it improves again without clipping the frame too much, so the stabilization is really good quality in this device. Because even when running with the main camera you are going to notice a good result. Recording backlit with the ultra-wide camera, note that we are not going to find a good balance of lights and shadows. There are overexposed areas in the rear. Even some jumps in the exposure are appreciated and the shadow area is very dark. With the main camera it improves slightly, but there is still overexposure in the rear areas and jumps in the exposure. Then it is definitely not a recommended device to record in this type of backlit conditions. The focus notes that it is quite fast in its response. In fact, sometimes it could seem very fast depending on the taste of each person. But fortunately, it remains stable even in subtle movements. So in this aspect, there is no complaint. Something interesting in slow motion is that it can be in 4K at 120 frames per second, so the result is spectacular for the high level of detail it has with this level of slowness as well. You could also record in 240 frames per second, although the resolution drops towards full HD, but it is still a good enough resolution to notice good slowness and good detail. But if you want, you can go up to 480 frames per second with even more slowness. However, the resolution continues to drop. In this case, it goes up to HD, which would be useful only for more casual publications in social networks and not so much for something professional. It also has a fast camera, although it seems to have little stabilization and the slowest it goes is 15%, which may be too fast for a little more subtle movements. So for scenarios of movements of people, I do not see it as recommended, but on the contrary, for landscapes, if you could achieve much more attractive results. Obviously, having the device on a stand as it has very good capabilities there. The front camera for video recording is obviously not very good, although if you are not backlit, I think it has improved significantly. However, when you are in backlit situations, if you will notice a slightly cloudy effect. Also, does not have as good stabilization, although honestly considering that it is behind the screen, the work seems to me very spectacular. Just have to make clear that if you wanted to record blogs or something like that, the quality really will leave much to be desired, especially as I say when you are in backlit scenarios. And also remember that it has fixed focus. Indoors we are also going to see that it has very little contrast and the image quality again leaves much to be desired. So the best scenario is when you have a lot of light in front of you. Because at night, observe again how it has too much noise due to the low light input because it is behind the screen. Then it is not recommended to use it in low light conditions or backlit. In its operating system, we will find pros and cons. Something positive is that it already comes with Android 15 and on it running REDMAGIC OS 10. However, it only has 1 year of updates. So it will only update Android 16. That is a clear disadvantage compared to other devices on the market, although fortunately they offer us 3 years of update patches. In the system we will find several options. For example, we find a section of themes that we can use to go customizing. With a single touch our device, it also has a good variety of wallpapers that you can use, some of them animated, even with some sections or characters of REDMAGIC. So, in that sense, if we are going to find something positive, in fact it also has an interesting section of a kind of wallpapers with mini games. So this goes 100% focused on gaming. For example, let's select this background and note that from your home screen you could play this kind of content, which are, let's say, popular and simple games that could also entertain you at some moments. Note that if we apply this background on our screen, we will be able to have that mini game preloaded, although obviously some icons could get in the way. So the ideal would be to perhaps remove some of the widgets that are available here so you can have access to the game, as I say, at all times, and there is a good variety of these mini games. So it is very... Of course it is a device that will focus a lot on video games, giving you the ability to also access this game, even Tetris, as you see. And even has the response in the vibration engine to feel with greater intensity the movements you give in these buttons. It also has some other games developed by REDMAGIC, as you see, so it is curious to find all these games on the home screen. I would have liked to see them integrated in the game section space, but all of them are focused directly on the main screen. It also allows you to change the speed of the animations from this section, as well as select a different color palette and figures of some quick settings icons. It also has this section that will allow you to configure the light that we have in the part of the fan and the other zones, although in this case they will only turn on while you are playing. However, you can also have these lights while playing a song or music in general, and you can select whether this lighting will be constant or if you want to go off and on softly or intensely. These lights can also be used to show you notifications, incoming call alerts, on alarms or while charging. It also has the always on display function that brings different covers that you can use to show on your screen. You can also display notifications and battery status depending on how you want to configure it. It also includes some BlackBerry covers, the mascotita, let's say REDMAGIC, and we will also find some special animations with analog clocks. digital, and also some phrases that you can configure in the settings of the main screen. We will also find the Zboard function, which will add a special page to our home screen. To the left, where it will recommend us some applications, some games, and news in general. Also, the device will allow us to configure the behavior of the controls area. As you can see, the design is nice. It includes a mini player and vertical controls for brightness and sound. We will also find the option of a more traditional format, where we slide and some quick access icons appear combined with the notifications, and we slide again to see the complete list divided into pages. Then you choose as a user the behavior that you like, if divided into 2 pages of notifications and controls or combined. It includes a section called REDMAGIC AI+, but it does not have much artificial intelligence, because in this section we find the sidebar settings, which is useful because it allows us to open applications in window. But it has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. In fact, in this case, observes as YouTube. Is also compatible, even Instagram is compatible, and in this case you can have a maximum of 3 windows open at the same time. All of them you can resize and move, as well as minimize in a small floating bubble. So the multitasking tool is considerably good, and in this section of artificial intelligence is supposedly also placed the intelligent communication it has with the antennas to choose the best antenna available from both the mobile network as well as from Wi-Fi. In general is not something so attractive for the everyday user. We're also going to have access to the fan settings in case you want to turn it on at another time and not just when you're gaming. When you turn it on, it makes a sound of a vehicle engine, and you can also activate different modes, fast cooling or balanced dissipation, depending on what you prefer to use at that moment. We are also going to find the option to have the fan turn on automatically while the cell phone is charging, and also pause it during calls to avoid any noise that might sneak in. We will also find the configuration of the lighting that will have this rear area of the fan in case we want multiple colors or a fixed color. Plus, different effects available if you want lighting all the time constant, or if you want it to have a certain flashing smoothly or quickly plus a burst flash. So there are several options that are available to configure that fan. I think it might be useful to keep it on so you know when it is on, as it is a remarkably quiet fan in balanced dissipation mode. And lastly, you can change the sound effect that runs when you turn the fan on, or you can turn it off completely, which is what I would do, as the sounds are pretty outrageous. But it depends on the type of user. In fact, there is also a widget on the main screen that you can use to configure the fan, turn it on, or even switch between different modes. We will also find the slider settings that we have on the right side, although it has a bad translation. In fact, in some areas of the system, we will find this kind of incorrect translations. But note that by default, it opens or closes the gaming mode. However, we could also configure it to do the same thing with the camera, and you can have quick access. You could also configure it for the flashlight, which I actually find more useful from my point of view, and that's why it's nice that the system allows us to configure what we want it to do. And you could also open and immediately start the sound recorder in case you want to do this, or finally switch between a silent or sound mode, or also vibration or sound, which could also be useful. So I would say to me that this is a very useful feature. I like that the manufacturer gives the user the possibility to choose. Also, the user can choose how the one-handed mode will behave if you want it to be a small window, which I personally prefer because it allows you to reach any sound on the screen, or you want it to be half screen, where whatever is on the top slides to the bottom. There's also the Z-Pop mode, which is this floating panel where you can have more buttons at your fingertips, and all of the buttons are at your fingertips. You can configure them completely to your liking, and note that you can also slide the notifications to the bottom to open those notifications in a floating window mode. For example, notice how when we receive a message by WhatsApp, we can simply swipe down and WhatsApp opens directly without interrupting the other application we were using, and that's it. And we will also find some other more traditional gestures and movements, as we have already seen on other occasions. Even shake the device while you are on the lock screen to turn on the flashlight with greater speed, and as a curious fact, if it brings a compass integrated into the system. Most software features will be focused on games, and later I will show you all its functions. With regard to security, note that includes an optical fingerprint reader integrated into the screen. i.e. it will emit a white light to recognize supports up to 5 records, and as you see, is not so fast. Although neither would say it is a bad reader or something like that, despite having camera under the screen, they dare to put facial recognition that I would say it would be very unsafe. And they also include Google Extended Unlock to be able to stay unlocked in environments that you consider secure. It also includes a Google Private Space feature that honestly seems that it is not very well implemented, because when you set it up, it will actually generate a separate section of work within the app drawer. But it has nothing to do with a private space, but rather seems to be a separate space for applications. And either way, they don't seem to crash or work properly, so in that sense, it's definitely not well optimized. However, fortunately, it also includes the My Vault application, where also through fingerprint or pattern, you can safeguard applications that you want to be locked. Made from the section you configure but are also locked completely even if you do not enter from the vault, then it is very well. And also here in the vault you can also store files, images and even passwords. Although the passwords will not be synchronized when filling out forms, it is simply a protected notepad, since at the time of login. Actually, what will be used is the Google Autocomplete, which, as you realize, the first time I have not requested any fingerprint or anything like that, also includes an option to clone some applications and have 2 accounts of them on the device itself. But to protect you against malware, you only depend on Google Play Protect, as it has no collaboration with any other antivirus. It does not have kids mode, so it is not the most complete, but it complies. In battery, the situation is a bit strange because the capacity is 7050 mAh. That is, it is the same figure that in China has the Pro Plus model. So it seems that we are actually talking about the Pro Plus model, but that globally came out with the name Pro, so they've caused a little bit of confusion in that regard. But let's talk specifically about the battery experience, because 7050 mAh sounds like a tremendous capacity. But the reality of things is that it performed in my test as a 5000 mAh battery, although this test is exaggeratedly demanding for the processor, and considering the tremendous cooling system that it has, and the fan, it is evident that in very demanding tasks the device goes. It will perform well, but similar to what other devices with 5000 mAh batteries would perform, only in this case with a very high raw power. In fact, when I did the background test, the dice showed that it has a very aggressive management of the apps that are running in the background, so it constantly shuts it down to keep improving the battery experience. However, if I would have liked to have seen something even more attractive, but as I tell you, combining an exaggeratedly powerful processor with a tremendous cooling system makes the battery also, let's say, suffer in that sense. Although in reality you will still have a good experience, but do not expect to have a much greater autonomy than you would have in other devices with 5000 mAh batteries. In fact, it is likely that this battery is divided into 2 cells, as the manufacturer has done on some other occasions. Fortunately, you have the normal saving mode and even an ultra saving mode that you could use to try to take advantage of the day-to-day. Obviously, the ultra mode is more focused on emergency issues because it restricts some other things. But now let's test the charging, because in the box, there's an 80% watt charger included, but again, in reality, the device supports 100 watts charging, so we could say that it is the Pro Plus model, but we used the charger that comes included in its box, and in 15 minutes it reached 44%. As you can see in the graph, this device maintains a very high charging power. Practically all the time it is charging. In 30 minutes it reached 75%, and the full charge was completed in 44 minutes. We are really in front of a device that charges very fast, and at this price, we are generally accustomed. We can see some features a little more advanced, but we will not find in this device as wireless charging or reverse wireless charging. It also does not have any smart charging mechanism, so if you usually leave the phone charging all night, you could get to ruin the battery faster. It also has no charging lock, although it has a similar function that is charge separation, which will send the power from the charger directly to the processor without passing the charge separation function. The battery is not affected, and this way you don't damage the battery and avoid overheating. So it can become an attractive mode if you want to be playing a very long session without worrying about the battery getting low. Let's go now to the connectivity issue. It incorporates 5G, although it does not bring any option to manually block internet access with your mobile data for some applications, as if it happens in other devices. It also supports Wi-Fi Network 6E, obviously going to have a very high download speed, so in that sense there is no complaint. A complaint if it could be that it does not support eSIM, so if you are thinking of going on a trip with him and hire some data plan with his virtual eSIM, you're not going to be able to use them here. What you will find is Bluetooth 5.4 for a good stable connection, and it also has NFC, so you can even make mobile payments. What it does not have is FM radio, which was expected, and obviously if you can connect accessories through the USB-C port. It also has both wireless and wired screen projection, and in both cases you have considerably good features. For example, it has an extended mode that allows you to continue using your traditional cell phone. But in extended mode, you can control the application with the cursor that appears on your device. Although it is not a desktop mode. Like the one we see in other devices, it also allows you to project your game and on top of the device to have a kind of special gamepad to try to play on a bigger screen using just this device. So we would also have, in that sense, more options to try to take advantage of the tools that this cell phone gives us. It is also compatible with Android Auto and has USB 3.2 to be able to transmit everything with a very good speed. And regarding sensors, there is no complaint. Yes, it has accelerometer, geomagnetic field sensor, gyroscope, a physical proximity sensor that should not give you problems. Regarding ecosystem, I think it is quite short in terms of interaction. Although REDMAGIC incorporates a lot of accessories, even distributes monitors, keyboards, and mouse, has other additional ventilation accessories and the like. So it does have a good catalog of products, but they don't have as advanced interaction as what we would see in some other proposals. In fact, they also have their own tablet, they have their laptop, they even have their watch, but I insist there is not such a good interaction between all these devices. So we could say that REDMAGIC doesn't really have such a well-developed ecosystem in many ways. It also depends on Google and its own technologies and services. Google Fast Pair, Google Quick Share, Google Drive or Google Photos and also Google Home. So in short, it is a cell phone very dependent on Google with respect to what has to do with ecosystem and services. Let's talk about performance as we do our traditional app opening test. In this case, the device integrates the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, a tremendous processor of the latest generation and one of the most powerful we are going to find. It is accompanied by versions of 12 or 16 gigabytes of RAM LPDDR5X Ultra, so they have decided to call it. In this case, I am testing the edition with 16 gigabytes of RAM, and in this case it took 1.5 seconds to open each application. Really, the performance is very high on this device, and obviously not only will open applications fast, but also navigation within applications will be super smooth. In this case, we will find virtually no complaints in terms of performance. Being a gaming specialist, all other applications also benefit from tremendous power. As for the RAM memory management, we will see that when we are switching between all these applications, it seems that there are no reboots that are affecting the experience, but everything has remained running. Remember that I am testing the edition with 16 gigabytes of RAM, and they seem to be perfectly well used. In fact, I find it very curious and exaggerated that we are also allowed to use virtual RAM, which in this case allows us to extend another 12 gigabytes of extended RAM. It is definitely not recommended to enable this option, but it comes as default. So you yourself are noticing that in reality the device maintains a very high performance, having all these applications running in the background, flat. Consider also that it has 512 gigabytes of storage in this version and is UFS 4.1 Pro. It gives us a very good capacity. There are also versions of 256 gigabytes or up to a terabyte. However, we must consider that it does not support microSD, so it is advisable to purchase the largest possible version. But it is not only a high-capacity storage, but in theory also of good speed. Although it notes that in this test, the read speed is falling way short compared to what we see on other devices. In fact, it is very disappointing to see this level of speed on this device in the read test. The write test is also falling very short on some things. At times it does peak a bit higher, but the read speed did disappoint. I do not know if it is due to the optimization of this application or what specifically, but it is giving us a very low reading speed. We could even compare it with low mid-range devices. But let's go to a real-life test. As usual, videos recorded with this device in 4K with a total duration of 1 minute, joining the clips, and that's it. It took about 17 seconds, not bad, although it did not beat the MediaTek Dimensity 9400 we tested on the Oppo Find X8 Pro, just as a fun fact. And then came the most awaited moment of this review, accessing all the games. To begin with, let's take a look at the game space, where we can collect all the games we have installed. Also, if it has not automatically detected any, we can add it manually. On the right side, we can access our profile information, such as the achievements we have had in different games, with summary of time we have invested in different games, in this case today, but also we can see the weekly graph to see the total time in different contents. We can also configure the network if we want to limit the speed of applications that are not related to the game and also protect the network switching. So you are not changing Wi-Fi, mobile data, and lose valuable moments in the game. We can also block the automatic brightness, improve the color of the game, and have a battery saving mode in some specific scenarios. We're also going to be able to disable the floating button, disable screenshot gestures, and we can even have the notifications in some other style. Notice that it can run along the screen to avoid interrupting us, but it can also have this special design in case you want it to draw your attention a little bit more. So in this way you can see the notifications that come to you while you are playing. In addition, you can also select whether you want it to look much more transparent or less transparent, and whether you want it to go faster or go a little bit slower. As you can see, you can select which apps the notification will look that way, so that's pretty cool. We will also find prevention of accidental touches on the sides or edges of the screen, also how you want it to behave when you try to project the screen to another monitor, and you can configure. Also the RGB lights as well as the game space wallpaper. And in the screenshots you can add the REDMAGIC watermark and even add a specific text that you want to select. So as you can see, there's a lot of options for the games. Even here there is also a button where we are going to be able to access some screenshots that we have taken while we are playing. There's also another button that allows us to access like our replays. You can also change this background style, and there is yet another button to configure the specific performance of each game. For example, in Genshin Impact, we could press this button to configure the touch response of the screen along with the edge protection if you want it to be at a small or wide level. You can also configure the performance if you always want that game to run in a high performance mode, as well as very specifically configuring how you want the Adreno Snapdragon GPU. By default, we run everything in standard, but as I say, you can access more specific settings as well if you want to have some sort of color filter on the screen, a low latency mode, and also how you want the fan to behave. Plus the configuration of the replays that you want to be recorded automatically. When we start the game, we will have even more tools, automatically activate different optimizations, and note that sliding from any of the sides we can access all this information. To start with, we can go back to the initial screen of our games, and we also have a button to access the notepad that we can have here with some tips or something similar. In fact, we can also drag some notes to the screen to have the instructions written there of some game or something similar. The third button allows us to configure the triggers, which in this case are configured in this area to replace the buttons that might appear virtually there, and as you can see, can. Configure if you want them to behave as a single touch, or also if you want them to do something else when held down, such as trigger constantly, also detect movement and many other things. The truth is that the behavior of the triggers is super advanced, so you can even configure that when you press your finger a button is activated, and when you release your finger another button is activated. So as I say, the truth is that the configuration of the triggers is too advanced. Besides, this configuration will be saved, and you can load different presets in this section if you want to quickly switch to a configuration of another game. The next button allows us to access the game-specific settings in the case of the system. And finally, we can change the view style of the additional plugins we have in this section. To begin with, there is a button that allows us to change the image style of the games. For example, we could raise the frame rate and change the image quality, this through artificial intelligence. So for example, in Genshin Impact in this case, having that option enabled, if it would be able to reach up to 120 frames per second, Even with the highest graphics settings, however, this configuration is not native to Henshin Impact, but it is through interpolated frames per second, which could overload the processor a little more, but definitely if it shows capabilities of execution up to 120 frames per second in Henshin Impact. However, for the specific test we did monitoring, we disabled this option and you realize in that sense it goes up to 60 frames per second. There are some other plugins like this manual counter if you need it for some specific scenarios where you need to have a count. We are also going to find another plugin that recognizes the gestures. For example, at the moment of making downward, the device can get to recognize some button specifically. For example, in this case, it could say that I change character when I make this gesture. And as you realize there, this change was made manually. And you can activate different gestures that we see here, like rotation on this axis, and on this axis. So that's 3 different axes that you can use to try to make the most of all the buttons that appear on the screen. You can also set up a specific wheel where you want the screen to respond much faster than normal. There is also another option that says free virtualization that allows us to simulate a wider monitor. This is something I had not seen on smartphones, so it can get to draw attention. For example, we can activate a 32:9 ratio, the game will restart. But note that now it will show us a much more spacious panorama, as if you had an ultra-wide monitor. In addition, you can select whether you want the view to be centered or also oriented up or down then. For adventure games or shooters, it can also be useful because you have a much bigger picture than your competitors if they are all using a cell phone. There is also another tool called screen extraction, which will allow you to resize a kind of minimap. For example, in this case, if we have a small map here that we want to see much larger in another position, we can simply select it and place it where we want, then watch. I have duplicated this map so that it also appears on this side, and this way you can arrange the elements that you want. There is also another function called Artificial Intelligence Trigger. In this case, it would allow you to recognize some scenes to automatically activate some buttons, for example. Here you can activate by image, extracting a screenshot of some character or something similar. After that, you select how much you want, the range of coincidence with that image, and the minimum interval when you take a shot. You can automatically trigger a macro or also trigger screen recording, a timer or something like that, or even just trigger an action or a tap on the screen when it recognizes that kind of object. Just select where you want the screen to trigger and that's it. Although it's really quite complex all this setup, so it can be very difficult to activate, but the availability of this tool is appreciated. We also found this random number generator that might be useful for some users. All these plugins, remember that you can turn them off and on from this bar. And there is also the data panel that you see that is going to show us a little more information in this part of the frames per second and some other things. There is also a plugin called Gravity X that would allow us to supplement our games with physical controls, either a gamepad or a keyboard. We can also enable auxiliary lines that are more focused on arena games, where you need to have something specific to an area. You can also select the dotted line, what color you want it to appear, and you can also enable timers specifically. Also, for those games that you can activate with a single tap, it can be useful to know how long you've been with certain powers or something like that. There is also the fixed sight button that you can have in shooting games. You can select a specific sight with some color. So even if the game doesn't support a sight in this case, you can mount a sight on top of it. You can also enable macros that support different quick touches and buttons or scrolls, although it's a bit complex to map all these macros and activate them. You can also activate a hunting mode that will illuminate the screen in different colors depending on the one you like the most, so that you can see your enemies more clearly. Once you select the color filter, you have to activate the effect with a floating button that appears above the game. There is also the scout mode, which is a kind of magnifying glass. Note that a floating button appears that you can activate too, to have a closer perspective. This is obviously going to be useful when you have the crosshair on and you want to have even a closer perspective. You can also reassign the keys or buttons that appear on the screen. For example, note that if we enable the A button, We will simply move a button that is placed by default on one side to have it on another side and with the size that we want. Interestingly, a sound equalizer is also available in case you want to go about configuring this for a specific game. And finally, what REDMAGIC calls devil mode, which will raise the processor frequency to full at all times, something that is recommended only in rare cases, but generally you will keep it disabled. And on the right side, we have direct access to some applications or shortcuts in floating mode so as not to interrupt your game. And we will also find quick shortcuts to turn Wi-Fi on or off. You can even say that even if you get interrupted in your game for some strange reason that you have to quit, the game remains running in a small floating window that you can then resume. Also remember that here you can change the running mode of your device along with the style of notifications you receive. You can also alter the screen refresh rate from this section and display the additional information panel that you will see on the screen. Shows you the frames per second, your network consumption, current battery, and how long you've been playing. And you can click on any of those parameters to minimize this so you don't have so much information. You can also enable replay recording with a pre-buffer, set the fan, lock the screen rotation, have screen recordings as well, optimize memory, reject extra touches, enable load skipping that just. The power will be transferred to the processor. You can also have some alarms configured here directly from the game panel and activate the connection to a gamepad or also the enjoy mode, where you will be able to project the screen and in this case, continue playing directly from these controls. Obviously, you have to configure how you want all these controls to behave, including the triggers, so you can place all these buttons wherever you want. But in this way, you will be able to control the game from the gamepad. You could play on a much larger screen. From this panel, you can also project your screen wirelessly or temporarily turn off this screen while the game downloads some content to not consume so much power. You can also take screenshots and reject calls as well as control the lighting. And finally, you can also customize all these controls so that everything is completely to your liking. And by the way, in the screen recordings, you can configure if you want to use the microphone and system sounds, and by default comes the medium quality, but you can go up to a higher quality. Although even from the medium quality, it retains the native resolution of the screen, it just goes to a bit lower bitrate, but the recordings come out fine. We tested a lot of games, so let's start with PUBG. By default, it was on the ultra extreme rate though. With low graphics, you could also configure another graphic quality, but the highest it reaches is an extreme rate. So we played it in that ultra extreme configuration. The game was 13 minutes and we were recording it at all times. We monitored only the last 2 minutes of the game, but at no time went below 118 frames per second. So this game, if it supports a very high rate, that takes advantage of all the capabilities of the screen, and obviously you're going to have a very positive experience when playing the game. Let me remind you that this device is premiering the new cooling system called Ice X. In a moment, I tell you everything that incorporates this cooling system as we go watching gameplays of different content. But here, what should also be noted is that all this system allows perfect control of the temperature. In this case, came just 30 and also played Asphalt, in this case, setting the graphics. I have to set it to the highest possible, although by default it was already configured that way. In this case, I must say that my game was quite short, but in summary, we can say that everything went very well. Although it does have some low peaks, which I found quite strange. I would have liked to see a 100% fluid experience. It is not something really serious. But if a few small moments of stumbles were perceived. It seems more game-themed because in reality the device even lowered its temperature with respect to the last game. Then we play Call of Duty, and by default it gives us the very high graphic quality at a maximum rate. We can raise the graphic quality to a maximum level, or raise also the frame rate to an ultra level, although the graphic quality is lowered to the medium level. Obviously having the highest graphic quality if we will find compatibility with all the additional effects. First we played with the maximum quality at a maximum rate. In this case again it was a game of 11.5 minutes. Recording the screen during all this time, monitoring the last 2 minutes of gameplay. But again, the experience was simply perfect, 60 frames per second practically at all times. If anything, it goes down only to 59 frames per second, so you really maintain an ultra smooth experience. In this case, it got as hot as 37.5 degrees Celsius. The device incorporates a fan that runs up to 23,000 revolutions per minute and has 58 blades. And that's just the first element of the whole cooling system it has. We also ran this same Call of Duty game, but now at an ultra rate. It was a game of about 8 minutes, and in this case the heat could start to be slightly noticeable, but this with respect to past games. Because with respect to other cell phones, it's still pretty cool, 39.4 degrees Celsius. But this was after playing all the previous content that I mentioned, and yet again it maintained almost perfect stability. A few small low peaks, but the lowest it got was 113 frames per second, so it's still considered exaggeratedly high. It maintains very good stability, so there's not much to complain about. Really, the gaming experience is going to be very good. Remember that in this case, one of its cooling layers is made of an aircraft-grade aluminum alloy, all this as I tell you, to cool the processor well. Then I played Henshin Impact. Obviously, we raised the graphics quality to the highest possible. In fact, by default, it already gives the high quality, but we raised to the top. In this case, default goes up to 60 frames per second, but remember that in conjunction with the Red Core 3 Pro chip can increase resolution and frame rate per second in the game if you activate the option in the special module, although in this case we did not activate that option and the experience was supreme. 60 frames per second, completely stable, not even had a small peak under the temperature reached 40.06 degrees Celsius. That to make this game in this graphic configuration, definitely that is cool. Also considering that it was a game of 10 minutes recording the screen at all times. So there is no doubt that this device is a specialist in everything that has to do with games. Even the current catalog of Android games can become a little short compared to the power that has this device, which in another of its cooling layers integrates rare earth of high thermal conductivity super soft. That has been the official description, but beyond all the technical terms and more the day-to-day experience, if it is translated into an excellent cooling. I also played PUBG New State, only in this case this game does not support specific monitoring of frames per second, so I just want you to see that I ran it in ultra quality at a maximum rate. I could also run it at 90 frames per second, but the graphic quality drops to the lowest, so I preferred to give this configuration, and it was a 24 minutes game constantly recording the screen and it behaves excellently. It is not free of low peaks. But in general, it only goes down to 59 frames per second, and the lowest it got at some point was 46 frames per second, where you can perceive some stumbling at times, but it is very sporadic. In all this 24 min game, there were probably only 3 drops. The experience is really very good, and by the way, I won the game just in case you were with dependent. I also played Fortnite, although it doesn't allow specific monitoring either. Note that in this case I selected epic graphic quality with high quality and everything as advanced as possible, and I selected 60 frames per second, although in reality it is limited to 45 frames per second. Possibly the game makes this management, as in reality the device is not able to exceed this. Most of the time it stays hovering at 45, 46. Even sometimes it says 47 frames per second, but does not exceed this figure. However, it does not go below this figure considerably, even in complicated areas barely. It goes down to 40 frames per second. And considering the high level of graphics it has, it was very good. Although in this case, I only ran a short game. In Car X Street, we raised the graphic quality to the highest possible. We also activated the motion blur. The smoke intensity was set to high, and we did not limit the frames per second. And in this case, again, the experience was very good at 60 frames per second on average, with a lot of stability, and the temperature was very low. It controls perfectly in 37 degrees Celsius, so it really runs very smoothly. When recording, the screen can get a little bit more noticeable low peaks. But it really is still an excellent experience, and remember that another of its cooling layers is graphene, which is specifically underneath the screen to cool it nicely so that your fingers don't feel uncomfortable when the device starts to heat up. We also played War Thunder, and in this case by default it defaults to high graphics quality, but we turned it up to max quality. We also set it to 100. 120 frames per second, and obviously turned on ray tracing at high quality, so we put in a pretty complicated setting and it definitely goes very smoothly. This game specifically shows very advanced graphics of very high quality with the reflections on the water and more. The temperature got up to 41 degrees Celsius, which shows how complicated this game was, but compared to other devices, the temperature is still very low. In fact, I would think that other devices with this configuration, I don't know if they could maintain the good level that this device has for quite a long game. In fact, other devices have stayed at 60 frames per second, but this one went up to 90 frames per second in the monitoring. Although curiously enough, it seems that when recording the screen drops to 60 frames per second, but it's still very good. I insist that the graphics look spectacular, so even with ray tracing, this device goes very used and well in its execution. Then we play Sandless Sound 0, as you have asked me to do, and in this case we again set the quality to the highest possible, activating the smoothing at 60 frames per second and everything that the device allowed us. And again, the experience is going to be supreme. There are low peaks of just 55 frames per second, so they are virtually unnoticeable. The game shows spectacular graphics and the temperature is very well controlled. In fact, it came out cooler than the previous game, reaching just 36.9 degrees Celsius. Although it must also be said that the weather has been a little cooler in recent days, so it may have benefited, but it still has very good cooling, as it also integrates graphene composite, a copper foil under the screen. So, this device is a specialist when it comes to gaming, not only because of all the tools that I mentioned a moment ago that it integrates, but also because of the good experience it has in terms of performance. All the animations and everything else is displayed perfectly in this game. We also played Lost Future, which some of you suggested to me, set the graphics quality to ultra at 60 frames per second with shadows enabled, and again it performs really very well. In fact, most of the low peaks were in some transitions when showing the tutorial instructions, but overall it performed considerably high. Lower was from 45, but I insist that it was generally seen at the moment of seeing the instructions and these kind of details. The temperature was well controlled, so there's not much more to say. Finally played Arena Breakout. In this case, by default, it is in HD at a super high rate. But we went up to Ultra HD at 120 frames per second, plus the smoothing was enabled and the experience was supreme. Again, it seems that the catalog of Android games falls a little short compared to the power that this device has power to spare. It is not seen that any game has caused any complications. In this case, it was at 119 frames per second on average. But the lowest peak was just 114, so it keeps very good cooling, also having 39.5 degrees Celsius on the outside. It should be remembered that in this case also has another sheet of copper with high thermal conductivity and also has thermal gel plus liquid metal, which is the maximum innovation that REDMAGIC has incorporated in this generation, and wow, it shows. The cooling is great, which allows you to run this type of content even in games. The device can be used for more or less prolonged periods of time without the device suffering at any time. So the gaming specialist has proved it again. This new generation continues to evolve and continues to offer us a great level of gameplay. In conclusion, this device definitely gives us a brutal performance when playing. Is his specialty. The games run perfectly, do not make you suffer, does not heat up at all. The experience with all the software loaded to complement. It is very good. The triggers also complement very well with good sound and good screen. What would be its weak points? I think it is very clear that would be the cameras, both front and rear. Video recording, there are several things focused on the cameras that definitely in the price are left owing. But you can get to understand that it is a device focused on gaming. For the moment, this has been all for this video. I hope you liked it. If so, you know you can indicate it, and we'll see you next time.